right. Hello, everyone. We're going to start soon. Thank you all so much for coming. On behalf of the Dawson Society, I welcome you to the third annual Dawson Debates. My name is Maria Rodriguez-Brannon. I am the president of the Dawson Society, which is a history, politics, and culture club on campus. Joining us here today is also Dr. Seward, the head of the history program, our club advisor, and he will also be our moderator for the debates today. Also joining us today is my wonderful leadership team, Helena Skid, our vice president, Alec, who will be debating, he's our public relations officer, Lillian Beauregard, she is our treasurer, and Audra Savakul, our secretary. Our night consists of 2 debates, each around 30 minutes long. There will be a short break in between the debates for if you need to get a drink or go to the bathroom, and there will be a social to follow with some charcuterie right outside. We are using the Oxford format for voting, in which an initial vote is taken, then the debates occur, and then a final vote is taken, and the winner is decided based on the turnover of votes. The affirmative and negative will each have 5 to 7 minutes for opening statements, followed by a 5-minute cross-examination from both sides, starting with the affirmative, and each will finish with a 4-minute closing statement. First up, we have Alec Stork. He is a junior history major and the public relations officer for the Dawson Society and acts for the UMary Dramatic Arts program. He is interested in American military history during the Civil War, and he will be taking the affirmative. And then for the negative, we have Lillian Beauregard. She is a junior history student and philosophy student. Originally from Oklahoma, she serves as the treasurer of the Dawson Society, is a Catholic studies student leader, and a member of the Gregorian Honors Program. She's currently preparing her history capstone on the conversion of decadent writers to Catholicism in 1890s England. Before we begin, I will have all of you, that is not, there we go. All of you could please take out your phones and scan the QR code. And our first question is governmental-led statue removal remedial or disruptive for historical memory? It's now closed. All right, to start us off on whether government sanction removal of statues is remedial or harmful for historical memory, we have Alex Stork arguing for the affirmative.
The question at hand here today, while applicable to several different societies across the world, hits particularly close to home for Americans. We live in a time and place where the removal of historical statues and monuments is becoming increasingly prevalent in discussion and action. And there has certainly been much action regarding historic statue removal. But in particular, this is regarding statues bearing controversial historical significance. A Washington Times article published in March of 21 points out how between 2015 and 2020, roughly 140 Confederate monuments had been removed in the wake of incidents like the shooting of 9 African Americans by a white supremacist at a South Carolina church in 2015 and the killing of George Floyd in 2020. Both these events sparked a lot of interest in the role of historic monuments and statues in relation to how a society views them. Now, the removal of these statues and monuments, while flagged with concerns of detrimental historical damage to things like historic memory, ultimately are part of a process of historical and societal healing. In regard to the question at hand, I am here to argue that government-led statue removal is, in fact, remedial to historical memory. It is important to make some clarifications on the nature of historical memory in a society. The collective memory of a people is ultimately something that is cultivated. The majority of people are not history majors who engage in work required to uncover historical realities. For most of us, public history is their source of a collective history. And this history is one that ideally is based on historical evidence and research, not myth. This is where it is important to emphasize a government-led element to public history and subsequently the removal of certain statues. There should be a process in which the ability and resources of municipal government works in conjunction and in tandem with historians to appropriately but accurately work to establish what our public history includes and what the narrative is alongside that. Memory is based on experience, and we modernly do not have the direct experience of many historical events to create an accurate memory of what historical events mean for our society. Our modern memory, therefore, relies on historical interpretations of the past, and this has the danger of being easily swayed by misinterpretation and misrepresentation through things, especially like statues and monuments. Therefore, it is important to stress that statues and monuments still play a role in public history, but it is statues and monuments that promulgate historical myths and cause painful derision through this that warrant removal. And so I clarify that I am not arguing today in favor of the destruction, defacing, or erasure of historical statues and monuments, but only the removal of problematic ones in order to present them in proper context, thus reflecting a remedial approach to our historical memory. This government-led statue removal is particularly remedial to historic memory in three major ways that I'd like to outline. First, it removes emotionally charged representation of history without proper context. It's hard to get around this as Americans, but when we think of this issue, we largely think of Confederate statues from the American Civil War, or more exactly, ones that were put up in the wake of the American Civil War, particularly in the American South, where certainly there was a lot of emotionally charged aspects that were influencing those being put up. Now, things like this often were put up in a way that skewed or glorified certain aspects of the memory of the war. Things like this threaten historical memory by warping the understanding of historical events through either a lack of context or sometimes intentionally misleading presentation. Secondly, removing statues gives us an opportunity to remove symbolism and images that are offensive and harmful to modern society when in a position of public glorification. So removing things like this allow for an atmosphere of comfortability and inclusivity to grow within society and opens doors for cooperation and unity between us modernly. Otherwise, leaving such symbols and images up in the public eye without proper context only serves to present a message of exclusivity in society by showcasing a glorified or celebratory context around painful historical memories. And thirdly, it allows for these images to be reintroduced into a more appropriate context that does not result in erasure, destruction, or misrepresentation of historical realities. And therefore, it adds to a more full historical understanding as a nation and as a society. So claims of removal to be destructive or erasive of historical realities only exist when such images and symbols are truly altered or destroyed in an effort to remove them in totality. Simply moving statues to be presented more appropriately within their own context allows them to continue to serve a purpose in informing society on historical events. To highlight this, I would like to indicate a bit of a case study here. As I've already indicated, as Americans, this highly touches us, this issue, in reference to Confederate statues, monuments related to the American Civil War. Now, sometimes monuments, they are put up by individuals and entities that have the means to do that and are not necessarily reflective of accurate historical events because of that. A key example of this, in the city of New Orleans, a little-known battle occurred after the American Civil War, known as the Battle of Liberty Place, in which a group known as the White League, which is as racist as it sounds, actually formed, armed themselves, and assaulted City Hall, killing many Metropolitan Police Force members of the city of New Orleans, and held the City Hall for 3 days. In 1891, a monument was erected to honor the dead of this, specifically to honor the dead of the White League. And that monument stood for a very long time. In 1932, the city government added a plaque to it, stating the United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, i.e. Reconstruction, elected officials. But the national election of November 1876, which marked the end of Reconstruction, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. Later on, in the 1970s, another plaque was added stating, although the Battle of Liberty Place and this monument are important parts of New Orleans history, the sentiments in favor of white supremacy expressed thereon are contrary to the philosophy and beliefs of present-day New Orleans. But this hardly satisfied anyone, warranting removal in 2015. Thank you.
Hello, my esteemed classmates, comrades, and friends. I want to begin my speech with a story. Three friends are in Eastern Europe walking the streets and they suddenly notice a statue. The first friend does not know anything about the statue. He takes the time to read about the person on a plaque. The second friend is fuming. This is a statue of a Soviet soldier. He's thinking of the millions of people who died because of communism. The third person is quietly praying. The statue was a memorial to the Soviet soldiers who liberated this town from the Nazis. His family would have starved if these soldiers had not risked their lives to save the town. They were both villains and heroes in his eyes. Afterwards, the three friends go to a bar, and despite their different reactions, they try to synthesize their accounts to make a just and merciful narrative about Soviet liberation, one which neither romanticizes nor dramatizes the event. From interacting with this public statue, this friend group displays what it is to have a good historical memory, looking in the past to find the human condition in its sin and glory, a theme that can be discovered in almost any statue or historical artifact. The statue is not responsible for the historical memory created by the friends. That came from within. However, by encountering the statue, it was something that enriched and aided in the integration of the past in their lives. In light of contemporary discourse, it raises an important question. Does the removal of a statue truly benefit historical memory more than allowing history to speak to us directly? When a statue is taken down, it leaves behind nothing but negative space. Its only lasting contribution to the community is an absence that, in my opinion, impoverishes both the integration and the healing of the community with the past. Every community holds a tapestry of complex memories, encompassing both heroism and trauma. Historical statues are valuable because they force us to engage with the tensions of the past. They prevent us from disassociating, repressing, or avoiding uncomfortable truths. When we remove a statue, it can feel like avoiding the process of addressing historical trauma altogether. It's like burning old photos of an ex 50 years after a breakup, an act that erases rather than integrates the lessons of the past. Instead, it feels like drawing a curtain over events that occurred, leaving them unresolved. And when the curtain closes, we also sacrifice remembering any virtues or redeeming qualities that makes our memory well-rounded. Additionally, statue removal also impoverishes a community's ability to pass down history. Without something tangible reminding us of our history, how often do we wonder about the past? Historical statues in the street sparks conversation. Are we to disrupt this opportunity by tearing the statue down? Likewise, statue removal also disrupts the opportunity of practicing virtue within historical memory. And I won't deny that we can also practice vice within our memory. We can exaggerate and jump to conclusions and create false narratives. And this is tragic and disturbing. But are we willing to forego virtue because of the risk of vice? Are we not confident that, like the friends encountering the Soviet statue, that we might also practice virtue and see the human condition as with it all of its failures and successes at once? Again, removing the statues removes an opportunity to remember the past well, develop intellectual virtues, and think critically, all of which are inherent parts of what it is to be a historical creature. But Lillian, you say, there are so many bad statues out there that were erected to glorify violating human rights and to commemorate villains. How does tearing down these horrible statues disrupt historical memory? Yeah, so bad narratives and artists with questionable intents exist for many objects. However, the object itself does not bear the sin of the artist, nor bears the fault if a community reacts or remembers an event poorly. It is a people's reaction to the statue that is problematic. This happens in toxic fandoms all the time. My Little Pony, Harry Potter, or 13 Reasons Why are exemplary examples of communities that takes a neutral object and use it as a motivation for vice. However, the statue ultimately remains just that, a statue. And even if the statue seems to make villains seem cool, that doesn't really matter. Because like a painting can have 100 interpretations, so do historical statues. Take a heroic statue of General Robert Lee. One person sees a statue and thinks of how conflicted he philosophically was over slavery, how he and his wife freed their slaves, yet also fought paradoxically for the South. Another person thinks of how he was a genius on the battlefield. Another of Lee's treason, how he owned slaves. To everyone, he may look noble on a horse, but how a person receives a statue is entirely up to them. Therefore, when we tear down these statues, even if they seem to glorify something immoral, we presume and override so many perspectives on that statue. It takes away the diversity of historical memory because it impoverishes our ability to remember an event together. It assumes that there is only one correct narrative within historical memory, and not many legitimate narratives with different emphasis. This is why government-led statue removal is particularly disruptive to historical memory. The government has no business regulating and dictating how people relate to the past. That realm belongs to the individuals, their hearts, their ideas, and experiences. Imagine if the government were to decide how figures like St. Junipero Serra, a Catholic state and historical figure, deserve to be remembered. It'd be akin to the government declaring the definitive meaning of a poem or a painting and whether it is good for us. But that is not how historical memory works. Such actions are unnatural and contrary to how humanity has always come to understand itself if it's from the government. And don't get me wrong, I believe some narratives accounts for different facts and some are better narratives than others. But when you consider taking a statue down or just retiring it to a museum, I want you to again consider the opportunity costs. How does this action enrich or deprive a community and its historical memory? To enrich the historical sense of the community, I would think you would want history to be in every nook and cranny, and not retire the only statue in town that reminds us that we are ever in history's grasp. As museums are failing, lots of historians are discussing how to enrich historical memory in public. Ideas include the contextualization movement, where historians want historical plaques all over the towns and surrounding existing statues, specifically controversial ones. Likewise, other historians want to express the diversity of perspectives with memorials, especially around controversial topics. They want to add counter memorials and statues all over the cities. Imagine how rich the U.S.'s historical memory would be if there were statues in every street. But this is ultimately what history is about: starting conversations, addressing wounds, knowing that every action is in the context of a greater picture, feeling brave to take your test because when you walk past the Vietnam Memorial, you know there are worse things that may have happened. Taking a time to hear a story from an African-American woman in front of a John Calhoun statue. This is why removing a statue has too high of an opportunity cost. These conversations, these opportunities for virtue and growth, these statues that ask you who you are and where you're going are so valuable. This is the purpose of historical art, to see the human condition.
I talk loud. So thank you, Lillian. That was a wonderful presentation of the negative side there of the topic here. I do have, of course, a few questions that I would greatly appreciate you expanding upon and some of the things you stated there in your opening remarks. To start off here, does a statue, I would like to hear this, does a statue holding a false historical memory warrant the respect of a public, remaining in the public eye? Namely, I'm indicating here, again, as I reflected in my own opening remarks, statues or memorials that are promulgating historical myth or warped perspective.
Can you kind of elaborate what you mean by like bearing a false historical narrative? Like, how does a statue do that?
Certainly. So for one thing, I'd like to reflect again, I'm going to keep bringing it back to Confederate statues as it is pertinent to us. But many of the statues erected following the American Civil War were in the American South that were put up to honor and reflect parts of the Confederate perspective. Is just that they were largely imbued with ideologies and perspectives that are entirely painted off of the Confederate viewpoint, and were largely done in ways to help promulgate things like the Lost Cause mythology, namely replacing what we know to be a major cause of the American Civil War through historical evidence, slavery, and instead focusing it on aspects like, states' rights or oppression from the federal government, things like that. So again, that's talking about skewing making a myth of something that was less prominent or straight up false?
Yes, thank you, Alec, for the question. I mean, the first thing you're kind of emphasizing on is the origin of the statues, which that a lot comes into that because, right, people can have a lot of bad reasons or things that they want to impose upon a statue. But the statue in of itself isn't saying anything, right? It's the people who themselves erected the statue who are then creating the mythology, the stories around the statue. I mean, when you're talking about a statue that like is promulgating a historical myth, what do you mean by that? Like the generals are super heroically standing there, really good looking, right? I mean, that's a literal question. And especially when it comes down to figures of where, you know, they did come from these perhaps wrong places. It's also through the perspective that we can even then come to understand that statue in of itself as a historical artifact, right? Talk about the people who erected them, and then talk about people's experiences from said with them, right? And then you can get the contextualization, right? The neighbors who knew those people part of the White League, the people who knew of some of the other moments of trauma, right? Talk to the person of the African American and actually make a conversation happen there that enriches the historical memory.
Thank you. Follow-up question here. You've mentioned a lot about the neutrality of statues, essentially, as they are just statues, and of course do not hold any meaning in them whatsoever, just stone. Now, if a statue creates a situation like this where it has, no actual meaning, only applied meaning, what happens when that applied meaning is taken and used as a sign or a symbol for something that is detrimental and problematic for American society? Case in point, there's a known statue of Robert E. Lee that was removed from the city of New Orleans once again in 2017, I believe. And that statue for many, many years was utilized as a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan, for events and demonstrations and marches and things like that. So again, what I'm posing to you here is what happens when a sign like that is utilized as a symbol of something detrimental or problematic in modern lived American society?
No, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, one of the things that I immediately drew my mind to was actually the usage of Our Lady of Guadalupe as a sign and rallying point. Because on the one hand, she is a rallying point of Catholics throughout the world, but within Mexico, she is also oftentimes associated as like symbols within gangs and has multiple different types of meanings within that types of culture. And so it kind of points of, it can be a rallying point, but just as that statue of Robert E. Lee can mean something for the white supremacists, he can also be a sign and symbol of a general who was respected by the North, even though they fundamentally disagreed on what to do of the Union.
Okay, absolutely. Now, one more question for you I have here. So you've mentioned priorly how there's a particular issue you see with government involvement in statue removal. Now, does the government not play a role in regulation in modern America or in any decent society, in my opinion? So, as providing the role of a regulator, why not in historical statues, where much like unregulated capitalism, for example, those who have the means can simply erect what, again, is their desired historical narrative, for example. So, again, posing this to you here, does the government not play a role in regulation, and does historical statues fall outside of this?
Yes, I think the government absolutely plays a role in regulation, but that usually means for things where it's protecting the rights of the people, right? It's going to regulate the economy in order that people are not becoming oppressed in such a way. However, I think it would be quite odd if you want to then say the government should also regulate art and in certain ways, certain types of free speech. Because what's happening with these types of statues is that's what they are, is they're a type of art that's being erected by the people, by the community. And then when you're asking if the government should regulate the statues, does that mean it's regulating the narrative? What happens if you disagree with the narrative? What then are the ramifications? That then gets into further disputes of like what are the natural rights of man and what is his relationship supposed to be with the government.
thank you so much for answering my questions. That's all I have for my cross-examination.
All right. Well, Alec, it's lovely debating up here with you. I really appreciate your time. So here's an interesting scenario that I've been kind of reflecting on concerning our debate. In recent decades, people have been increasingly expressing discomfort about the whitewashing of Jesus in public monuments and church art. Do you think, in the interest of historical accuracy and fairness, such as worrying about like the historical mythology of missionary imperialism, such statues should be removed?
It's a wonderful point, Lillian, and I'm glad you brought this up. Thank you. Ultimately, with situations like you've just pointed out, or even with other statues, of course, there's a lot of questions that get brought up about where do we draw the line, of course. Where does a statue of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson become problematic because they own slaves, things like that. Ultimately, we're getting away from a point that I've already made clear here, is that we're talking about statues that cause societal issues and problems.
I think it is potentially going to cause severe types of disruption.
Okay. Has there been shootings or killings in relation to things like on the caliber of racial inequity in America?
I cannot directly point to correlation within the U.S. However, I know within Europe there are increasing attacks on Christian churches, and that could very easily be because of the historical memory the Christian church plays.
Very easily could be. Yeah, these are words.
I would argue it is. Would you say it is possible to create a statue that portrays a historical figure in a glamorous way, but the community itself does not glorify the figure?
Can you say that again?
Do you think it's possible to create a statue that portrays a historical figure in a glamorous way, but the community itself does not glorify the figure? Think of the example of
Yes, I absolutely can. As personally already mentioned, we do have statues that are made and maybe not exactly taken in a glorious way. For example, like I've already said, George Washington or other figures like that. Or there's monuments like at the Battle of Little Bighorn. You've got monuments reflecting the American soldiers who were killed there. Additionally, you've also got monuments reflecting Native Americans, warriors who were killed there. So very much at the end of the day, you can have a statue and a representation like that is then not taken one way by the public. And therefore is not problematic and not warranting taking down.
Do you think removing statues is the absolutely necessary step? Or can other methods, such as counter-monuments or contextual plaques, like those in museums, effectively correct historical narratives? I mean, that was one of the things you actually proposes, not destroying them, but putting them in museums. Why not make it a public museum there in the environment, in the community?
I very much agree with that. That is a point I am reflecting here. I am reiterating again, I'm not arguing for destruction, defacing, erasure. I'm arguing for recontextualization of statues. And sometimes that means removing them from places in which they have already been well established, and it is difficult to simply add on in a way that is meaningful or even very effective. Case in point already made regarding the monument of the Battle of Liberty Place, in which they added two plaques. One, which only doubled down on white supremacy, and then the second, which really tried to backpedal, understandably, in the 1970s, and then ultimately did not make anyone happy, to the point where that monument underwent a lot of vandalism and graffiti before it was finally voted to be taken.
Do you think that could have been even further historically contextualized if they then erected famous figures of black men across the street? So like have figures like Martin Luther King Jr., or have figures of that dynamic of where it's directly opposing and then contextualize the community there?
If everybody's got a microphone screaming at each other, is it really productive at the end of the day? If we just put up statues everywhere reflecting one idea and another, is that actually going to open up a conversation, or just put us in an echo chamber where we put up our statue, look at it, and say, good job?
Do you think in future years, after perhaps some of that sentiment expressed by the white supremacist dies down, that statue has a place within the historical context in a public setting?
Yes, absolutely. And as I've stated once again, I am not arguing for destruction or erasure, but recontextualizing, representing things like this to be used as a teaching tool.
Time.
Thank you.
Concluding statements. Go ahead.
as we're wrapping this up, I think I've made an aspect of my case here very clear, and I am going to reassert it one more time for those who maybe didn't hear it. I am in no way, shape, or form arguing for the destruction, erasure, or any such vandalism of monuments or statues or things of this nature. I am arguing for removing these items when they are detrimental to American society to a point in which having them up in their original context and position is only problematic and hurtful to us modernly here today. And again, removing a statue from one place, simply moving it, putting it in a lovely public museum and representing it with a plaque that explains the issues of it and its position in the historical narrative of our nation and of a society is only going to help improve ourselves and reflecting on who we are as a people, where we come from, and what we've done. Now, one small note I do want to add here as I close up on my finishing statements. I'm going to reinsert again some of my major points here on why it is remedial. Again, removing these statues removes emotionally charged representation of history without a proper context, in reference again to, like we've talked about a few times already, statues or monuments that promulgate myth. Additionally, removing symbolism and images that are offensive and harmful to modern society when in a position of public glorification is a benefit. I don't think anyone here would ever argue against working to bridge the gap and better understand subsections of our own society and to know each other and respect each other as human beings more. And finally, it allows for these images to be reintroduced into a more appropriate context that does not result in erasure, destruction, or misrepresentation, to beat that horse one more time. But I will leave us here with another reflection. It's been said a lot here that a statue does not have any inherent meaning and that we all ultimately apply it. Does not our own reflection and applied meaning speak volumes about what we take from a symbol or an image? Case in point, I will leave you here with a very interesting statement. Now, this was a statement released in 1889, October 31st, 1889, 24 years after the end of the American Civil War, in response to the placement and the erection of the first Confederate monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg, honoring actions there. This is a statement released by the Abe Patterson Post, number 88 of the Grand Army of the Republic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is a Union veterans organization. And in response to the erection of the statue, they stated, "As soldiers and citizens, we have no apologies to make for calling words by their proper names. Traitor a traitor and rebel a rebel, that we in common with all lovers of the Union never recognize Confederate states nor Confederate armies, but look upon every man that takes arms against the flag as a rebel, and any state that acknowledges secession as a rebel state. While we can take the hand of those who fought against us and forgive their acts, we cannot forget their deeds. And as long as rebel organizations at their meetings display rebel flags and glory in their past evil action, they are unworthy of recognition by Union soldiers or loyal citizens and should be condemned by all who love the flag of this nation. We reiterate that we are opposed to the erection of monuments by the great or small upon the battlefields of Gettysburg or any other place that will in the slightest degree make glorious the deeds of those who trampled underfoot the national ensign. We believe in making treason odious." Statues, monuments, they do have meaning. Even if it is applied, they have a meaning and they have a consequence.
Thank you, Alec. But I will say they do have a meaning, but it is still first and foremost personal. It's a personal meaning with each type of interaction you have with that statue, right? The Robert E. Lee statue is going to have a different meaning to the woman who lived down the street, who knew him as a boy, who considered him the boy who went far, who doesn't even know anything about his political beliefs, but the statue was erected and it was the neighbor boy who was sweet to her. That meaning is going to be fundamentally different than the politician who erects it, who says, at like the Memorial of Gettysburg that you just read. But that is a personal meaning that is different. And especially when we're in and evaluating statues centuries later, when we're talking about the removal of statues by the government, it's important to take into that context of, as we move away from the statues, at what point does it consider to be recontextualized? To what extent does that have to happen before it's okay to put the statue back up? A statue, as I have stated, is fundamentally a piece of art. It does not say nor propose anything. It can make a figure look heroic and important, but it is ultimately metal clumped together in a pretty way. The actual narrative and response surrounding an object can only be faulted on the people viewing the object, and taking down the statue is not going to fix their understanding of history. For the people who glorify untruths about history, this stems from their lack of virtue and potentially something much more malicious that ought to be addressed in a debate that is not here at the Dawson Society right today. Don't have the time for that. However, on the opposite spectrum of vice and virtue, we have people who look at statues and who perhaps get emotionally charged about them, but they're not necessarily in the majority. What about those people, the minority? Who protects them if we're going to be getting into the business of taking down statues? Who represents their interests? And it's really interesting because if we're going to get in that category of going down to the every single nuance and reason that a statue is being erected, it almost makes me feel like we're going to be fearing all sorts of people falling in love with the Pygmalions, right? Just falling in love with the statues that they create and then somehow falling into a narrative, when that is not necessarily what the statue in of itself is doing, because the statue is not speaking. Christopher Columbus isn't proclaiming the earth is flat and the moon landing was fake. That's not what's happening there. He simply stayed standing there, and then people are saying he is the reason why millions of indigenous people died, and therefore we ought to blame him. But the statue did not kill anyone there. He was simply standing in whatever town that he was erected in, and for the meaning mostly of being proud to be here at America, and the land of which immigrants in their masses and huddles and in poverty were able to come and find a home and pursue an American dream. But I also have other issues. Man is fallen, our memory is imperfect. Do we want to control the narrative, control what goes on inside each person's heart and mind, and let the government decide that when it chooses if it brings down a statue or not? Because for me, I feel like then it's no longer a communal memory. It's no longer a memory that's personal, in discussion and discourse with each other. Instead, it is a narrative that is controlled. It's almost, it makes me think of the Cultural Revolution in China, of where all of the monuments had to be handled in order to properly constitute to fit with what the government wanted. And it is from this context that I really, truly think that, especially in terms of trying to control the personal relationship with each person with the statue, it ought to be reconsidered. And yes, contextualization is important, but to what extent does contextualization will lead to it being contextualized enough that it's then okay? When are we healed enough? When can we let it happen?
Thank you guys so much. Can we hear it one more time for Lillian and Alex? All right, we are going to go ahead. We're going to go ahead, if you guys could take out your phones one more time and vote again. We'll give about 1 to 2 minutes. All right, the results are in, and our winner for this first debate, which is the government sanction removal of statues remedial or harmful for historical memory. Our winner is Alex Stork, arguing for the remedial position. Can we please give him a round of applause? Thank you, guys. All right, thank you guys so much. We're going to move on now to our second debate. We have Daniel Freilich and Ryan Johnson debating the question, would it be in the benefit of the United States to implement tariffs on certain goods? We have Ryan in the affirmative. He is a junior student studying communications with a minor in philosophy. He enjoys video editing, writing, and engaging with current events. For the negative, we have Daniel, who's a senior politics major with a minor in economics. He is the president of Marauders on Politics. Some of his academic interests are political philosophy of John C. Calhoun and Austrian economics. He is planning on attending law school next fall. If you all could please take out your phones and do the initial vote. Thank you. All right, the polls are closed. Starting us off is Ryan, arguing for the affirmative. Please give him a round of applause.
All right. Well, I want to thank the Dawson Society for hosting this debate, Daniel for debating me, and cliche as it sounds, all of you guys for showing up to this. I do consider it an honor. It's important to establish at the outset that while we do hear a lot about tariffs on the news nowadays and a lot of yelling about how this or that proposal by this or that president is effective or not, Daniel and my debate will not directly relate to any of those proposals. We're taking a broader approach to this. So he has agreed that his position will be arguing for 0 tariffs overall. So that means we will completely cut off any tariff implementations. I will be arguing for some tariffs in strategic reasoning for certain goods. First off, I'll argue that tariffs are excellent in building leverage for negotiations, particularly with regards to countries that are economically reliant on the United States. So when the United States is negotiating for her citizens with other countries, something that every country on earth should be doing, it is very helpful to leverage our economic might with the threat of tariffs. So in particular, there are a lot of countries that are reliant on us and that need our trade to prosper as a country, whereas we do not need them. So that gives us a lot of leveraging power in our negotiations. A very recent example of this, I said we wouldn't directly relate to it, but we will talk about it a lot. Just last week, President Trump announced 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada if they did not shore up their border security. Both those countries would be impacted severely by the tariffs, and because they understood that, they both acquiesced within 24 hours of the tariffs being announced and agreed to strengthen their border security with particular regard to fentanyl drugs, which is a drug that is killing 70,000 Americans a year on average. So it's no understatement to say that this move by President Trump in threatening tariffs may end up saving thousands of lives if the security measures are implemented as they should be. So that's a case where I think it was absolutely in our best interest to credibly threaten the use of tariffs. Secondly, if we do want to implement tariffs, which is really fun, tariffs can also be very effective in preventing our foreign enemies from disrupting our national and economic security. So America does have enemies. There are countries that are trying to undermine our status as the top world power. And as an American who wants our country to succeed, and as a Catholic who wants to promote world peace, I don't think those are good things that should occur. I think America should be the top dog in respect to all these things. So a lot of our enemies, though, will employ dumping tactics as a foreign play to harm our economy. Dumping is a strategic maneuver certain companies will take where they will, foreign companies I should say, where they will sell goods to the domestic markets in the United States at prices significantly lower than market value, oftentimes to the point where they're not even recouping a cost. They're doing this not because they're nice or they want to see us succeed or give us cheap goods, but because they think in the long term it will ultimately harm our national security. And almost always these companies are also being subsidized by their foreign government. So let's just take a random item here, steel, and a random country, China. Let's say China was Let's say China was dumping steel into the United States and they were subsidizing companies to do so. If they did that, we could expect that the domestic markets for steel would crumble and we would no longer have any domestic procedures for them. What would then follow is next time we're negotiating with China about Taiwan, about our national security, about certain trade deals, they'll have a lot of leverage against us because they can threaten to cut off our steel supply and ultimately harm our entire economy. This is not something I want to happen at all. I don't think it's in our best interest to see that occur, which is why we take measures like implementing tariffs to prevent it from happening. And I'll note, this is a very important point, you'll often hear people say that tariffs are anti-capitalist and that they promote government intervention in the economy. If we implement tariffs in this case, it actually dissuades government intervention into the economy. It prevents a foreign government from putting their own money into a company to sell goods at a significantly cheaper price so they can nefariously impact our economy and make us reliant on them. I don't want that to happen. Neither did President Trump in his first term. Second time I've said that guy's name. In 2018, he implemented a steel tariff on Chinese goods because they were being dumped into our communities. And these were later also kept by Biden, so there was bipartisan support for these efforts. Ostensibly, these were to promote the manufacturing industries in the United States, and to a large degree, they did do that. Economist Jeff Ferry noted that from 2017 to 2018, we saw our largest increase in manufacturing jobs in over 20 years. This was an industry that was ostensibly losing jobs through most of its cycles, but it saw its largest resurgence in 20 years. Economists were terrified that these tariffs would end up hurting the larger economy writ large, but if you look into the actual statistics, medium income, inflation, and employment all stayed at very, very, very impressive numbers throughout the years following these tariffs implementation up until COVID. So if you look at its broad impact on the overall economy, it was at worst a negligible impact. Some minor goods may have increased in price, other goods may have actually decreased in price due to various reasons, but most Americans would not have noticed any significant impact to pricing. So we have a trade-off of one American economy being revitalized and thousands of Americans getting high-paying jobs in really competitive industries that do not require college degrees, we see an overall negligible impact on the larger economy. I think this is already a pretty good trade-off, but it gets even better when we remember that the goal of tariffs is not primarily economic prosperity. The goal is to keep America independent from foreign economies who would love to see us dependent on them. It's to ensure markets are free from unfair government intervention, and it's to leverage America's economic might to help our nation prosper as a whole. We can do all those things through tariffs, and we can do them without seeing almost any effect on our overall economy. And that speaks to both America's power as the world's strongest and most prosperous nation on earth, and it speaks to the utility of tariffs when they're used responsibly and reasonably. So for that, I think there are very good reasons to use tariffs. And I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
There was once a baker who ran a small bakery. He made decent enough money, but one day there were some kids in the neighborhood who were playing baseball. And one of the kids hit a big one, a home run, like Babe Ruth stuff, right through the baker's window. Now, the kids ran off before the baker could catch the kids, so he had to pay to replace the window himself. $250 down the drain. Now, some passersby come and see the window maker installing the new window and think to themselves, well, at least there was a bright side to this catastrophe. The window maker now has new business. He is better off due to this errant home run. He can now feed his family and spend his money elsewhere. I mean, perhaps this whole mess was actually for the greater good. This, my friends, is what is known as the broken window fallacy. The people see the new window, and they see the window maker. But what they do not see is what now cannot happen. The baker was going to spend some of that money on a suit later that day, or some gifts for his wife and kids. So the window maker's gain is the tailor's loss, as is the loss of anyone else he might have spent his money at. but their loss is invisible. Now, I bring all of this up because every tariff falls into some version of this broken window fallacy. It's easy to see the goals or to see those who might benefit from a tariff policy, but those who are victimized by it often go unnoticed and go invisible. Now, my opponent is correct. If he can show that there is a good that it would be in our interest to have a tariff actually implemented in, then he wins the debate. But I am confident that I can win for two reasons. One, there is not a good economic argument in favor of tariffs. And secondly, any non-economic arguments in favor of tariffs or any non-economic goals that could be achieved by tariffs could be better achieved by other policies that do not come with the crippling downsides. So on the first argument, despite what certain unnamed politicians may or may not have said, tariffs do not make an economy stronger. To see this, let's think through the effects of one example tariff. In 2018, we placed a 25% tariff on all Chinese steel. Now, this steel saved some jobs in Pittsburgh. The voters saw this and said, look, the tariff did what it was supposed to do. However, they don't see what now cannot happen. Because the only way that a tariff can work is by making foreign goods more expensive in comparison to American ones, consumers now have to pay more out of pocket. But it isn't just consumers that have to pay more, it's also other American industries, such as automobile manufacturing and buildings, or in construction. And what we see, and it gets even worse, that these businesses that needed to use steel as an input needed to raise their costs and also needed to let some workers go. Lydia Cox is an economist, and what she discovered was that our tariffs on China in 2018 on steel, for each job that they saved in the steel industry, we lost 6 jobs in other fields. And according to a study done by the Peterson Institute several years ago, for each additional job created in the steel industry, we spent an additional $650,000 on steel-related goods, meaning that it literally would have been cheaper to pay all of these new workers $500,000 to do nothing and continue to buy foreign steel. The problem is, like with the story of the window, that these victims are invisible, like the jobs that could have been created in fields that we have advantages in. Jobs in areas like tech or any other industry that America has an advantage compared to other nations now have less money, less investment, less capital, less workers that can work in these industries and suffer as a result of this. And what we also see is that those who are hurt the most by tariffs are those who are at the lowest level of income. Now, paying more, relatively speaking, for a house or a car might not be a big deal for someone who's a wealthy businessman, but it is a big deal for the common, everyday American. Now, I've cited a very specific tariff to demonstrate why tariffs don't work well economically in general. But the same thing would apply if the tariff were a smaller amount. Just like pouring less gasoline into a burning building wouldn't have the effect of putting the fire out, it would just cause the building to burn a little bit slowly, or less quickly. Now, I'm starting to run out of time to discuss the other half of the tariff argument. So instead, let me tell you a story about the non-economic half. One day, I went to the doctor's office, and I said, "Doctor, I have an infection on my arm. Please, fix it." So the doctor says, "Sure thing, Daniel." He pulls out a hacksaw and then amputates my arm. Now I'm screaming, "Doctor, what are you doing?" He says, "Why, Daniel, I am curing your infection." And I say, "Doctor, we are living in the 21st century. Couldn't you have picked anything else, any other treatment that could have solved this issue without causing so much unnecessary damage?" And that's the point. At the end of the day, tariffs might be able to address some legitimate infections. They might be able to protect some legitimate national interests. But there are alternatives. There are other treatments to this illness. There are other things that we can do that don't inherently pose a burden on those who have the least. There are other things that we can do that don't stifle innovation. And there's other things that we can do that don't cause disastrous impacts for a great amount of American people. So just keep that in mind today when we are discussing the alternatives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for that. I actually have a question I do not know, which is not how I envisioned I'd be asking these, but I'm curious about this. So you cite both those economists who say that we lost 6 jobs per every one we gained. You also said a lot throughout the debate that we're talking about unknown losses and how these things go in the background unnoticed by people. So I know economics loves to project. Are these projections being made by people? How are they finding out that 6 people are losing a job?
So these results were compiled by the National Tax Institute, or I wrote down here. Yeah, which is the National Tax Federation, which is a nonpartisan organization. And these were studies that were done after the fact and did the basic mathematics. I'm not entirely sure what methods that they used, but these were longitudinal studies done by professional economists.
Okay. I don't doubt that, and I'm not saying those statistics don't matter, but I think we should contextualize them under the fact that just on the root statistics that most American households are going to care about, like median income, like inflation, like unemployment, which I'll get to in a second, relates directly to what you were just talking about with the job losses. 2018 through 2020, up until the COVID pandemic, we did see record prosperity overall. Would you dispute that?
I would not disagree with that, but I would like to add that just because something good can happen, or just because something good can happen at large, doesn't mean that a specific policy contributed to that good thing. If I won the lottery, I would have a pretty good, if I won the lottery and someone ran over my dog with a truck, it would still be a pretty good overall day for me. But my dog dying would not have contributed to that being a pretty good thing.
Okay, that's great. Well, I do just, I do just want to question though a bit. Unemployment in particular was almost always at what economists would consider 0% functionally, which is to say it was hovering around 2% most of the time, and that's considered functionally at 0% because those 2% are always just people who are in between jobs or maybe they're high schoolers. So it seems like throughout those years, everyone who wanted a job could get a job. I apologize, I don't have the exact statistics for the unemployment rate, but I do know that throughout that entire 2-year period, it was almost always at what is considered functionally 0%. So I am actually just confused as to how we can account for that. It doesn't seem like there were many people who got laid off from work. I'm sure some people did get laid off, but laid off and then couldn't jump back.
Well, look, if we're looking at the jobs that were actually destroyed, we have, like I said, we have studies, Lydia Cox, the Peterson Institute, that point to the amount of jobs that were lost and were destroyed by these tariffs. Now, just because, like you said, a job gets destroyed doesn't mean you can't get a job elsewhere. And there were a lot of other policies, not tariffs, that were implemented in Trump's first presidency that could have had an opposite effect on the tariffs. But again, it does not serve to prove the point that it was in our interest to have the tariffs. It only proves that some of the other policies could have slightly negated that fact.
Okay, but when you talk about negations, you're talking about a number that is functionally at 0%. I mean, I can also point to inflation at a thing where there's just a degree to which we can't get inflation much lower. So at those points in the economy, I mean, you did use language throughout your opening statement, like ravishing effects, and it had this disastrous effect. You know, I would expect to see, like, let's say inflation was at, like, slightly above average. Okay, you can point to that as something that Americans are going to care about, and then you can say, look, this is something that the tariffs did impact the average American with. But when they're at a point where you say, we literally functionally can't get any lower than this, I don't really see how we can say.
Again, we're talking about a national market. And tariffs don't apply to everything in that market. For instance, washing machines, according to a study done by the University of Chicago, which did have a 20% tariff on, went up 15%. Now, other things could have gotten cheaper. There were tax cuts. There were other things that could have caused things to become cheaper. But that doesn't change the fact that the washing machine tariff, for instance, made it much more expensive and much more difficult for an everyday American to afford one.
Okay. Well, I don't need to necessarily support the washing machine tariff. I'm talking specifically about the steel tariffs, in which we can pretty clearly say, with how they were implemented, I mean, you talked about car prices increases. Those actually increased at a rate lower than average inflation. So they did increase, but at a rate where most Americans were it was becoming more affordable for them to buy them throughout those years, and those were an industry directly affected by them. So again, I mean, you're right. I can't just say that these didn't have negative effects somewhere, but in the broad aspects of how the economy was functioning, it looked like things were pretty good for the average American, and it really couldn't get any better.
Okay. So I'd like to begin by noting that both Ryan and I had access to each other's opening arguments and sources. Ryan, in your opening argument, you cited a source, Jeff Ferry from the CPA. Can you explain to the audience what the CPA is?
Yes, the CPA, it is a conservative economist group. They are pro-Trump. I'm not going to pretend like they're an objective bipartisan force, but there you go. It's an intelligent person.
According to their own mission statement, they are a labor and manufacturing group that backs tariffs and currency moves. So are you asking everyone in this audience to trust the economic assessment by a lobbyist who was paid to hold that position from 2018, which was just months after the tariff was implemented?
I will say we should take what he says and examine how true it is.
So 2018, so most of these effects that you were just mentioning, like the unemployment being marginal, I mean, isn't it just possible that things just hadn't adjusted yet? It had just been months since the tariffs have been implemented when your article was written.
I was pointing throughout my discussion with you, I was pointing more towards the unemployment rates throughout Trump's term up until 2020 when the COVID pandemic hit. Again, I unfortunately don't have those numbers at hand, but I don't think most people recognize that it was at a rate very low throughout those times.
Okay.
I don't think you would dispute that.
Again, general unemployment was low. That doesn't mean tariffs were helpful or beneficial to that. But let's talk about anti-dumping laws. What defines a fair price?
How about this as a simple rule? If they're charging a price that is below the cost to produce them, where they actually are losing money on the good, that defines a price that isn't fair. If they're not recuperating costs.
Their cost or the U.S. cost to produce them?
The cost they have to produce them, yes.
Okay.
Like in their company. I know oftentimes there are goods that are sold at a lower price simply because their country has different regulations, so it's easier to produce them. But the United States standard for determining whether something is actually being dumped or not does take those things into account. So it's made by a bipartisan group inside the federal government, not connected to like a specific administration. They're connected more to like the Department of the Treasury.
Okay, so one thing I'd like to address. In 1933, we passed a bill known as the Buy American Act. And what this did was essentially ensured that for large products, the U.S. federal government had to purchase from U.S. manufacturers. How are the Chinese going to drive our steel industry completely out of business if the steel industry is already guaranteed America's largest customer?
Well, I was more talking on the sphere of like if we need an immediate amount of steel quickly, so let's say a war occurs and we need to mass produce tanks. If our steel industry is regulated to occurring like supporting one specific industry of the government, we could have question marks about how quickly they could move towards mass producing specific things. Largely speaking, China could, in an instant, say, I'm going to make you reliant entirely on your current steel industry. And I don't think we'd want that to occur.
Well, right, but we import steel from lots of other countries, right? Japan, Mexico, Canada, all of these countries we import steel from. So I think you're selling the audience a fiction when you tell them that China will just drive all of our people out of business and then jack the prices up. I mean, what it sounds like to me is you're essentially saying that the Chinese government is spending untold amounts of its own money to make things cheaper for us just so they could potentially upset our market for a few months?
Well, I'm telling you something like that for sure. I would at least.
I mean, why not send them a thank you note if that's what's actually going on? I mean, I'll be the first in line.
All right. Great. one of the things I'll note, you talk about negotiate, or you talk about how we do import from other countries. That's right, but trade deals take a while to facilitate if we're not importing large amounts from countries. I mean, it takes time for them to cross the canals to get to us. So we would be talking about a significant upheaval if we do end up relying largely on Chinese industries.
Including tickets? Go ahead.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Well, I think I have set out in this debate to prove that there are good reasons to propose tariffs on countries. And I do not think Daniel has done a good enough job in showing that there are not reasons to do so. For the first part, I would just take something Daniel has just said about sending China a thank you note. All right, so let's just take as a rule that what the United States government found was true, that the United States is, or China, I'm sorry, is dumping goods into the United States. Do we trust China? Do we think they really want us to be having this gay old time with just all these cheap goods? Daniel can send them a thank you note, but I think China is pretty smart. I think they know what they're doing, and it's obviously not the largest effort in them, but we should resist their efforts to send these goods to us at these cheap rates. And that ties into something else I should note. Daniel made a good point earlier about how we need a specific we need to weigh the cost of what we're using, and we need to use other maneuvers to resist these policies, these anti-dumping policies. Well, he didn't suggest any of them. And I would further note that tariffs are specially aligned towards helping us handle these dumping conundrums that other countries impose on us. Let's take it really simply. If a foreign company is selling steel at a price to the United States, 25% lower than the cost to recuperate them, and if China is imposing, a 25% subsidy onto them, then us taxing them 25% completely offsets the money they're getting from China, and all it does, it doesn't stop them from trading with us, all it does is force them to play by the same rules other countries need to play by, mainly not being subsidized by an evil communist government. So tariffs, aside from being an effective strategy, they're also a good way of delivering justice. They tell companies, you are going to play by the same rules every other company does. You're not going to take government subsidies. You're not going to try and rip off Americans. All you're going to do is produce steel and sell it to us at a reasonable price where you can recuperate the costs at your own expenditure. So it's not just a strategically smart move, it's a move that ensures that there is justice on the economic stage and that capitalism can actually flourish on the world stage free from government coercion. Finally, I'll note, we didn't get to talk about this because we talked about a lot of stuff, but Daniel's proposal would essentially make it impossible for us to ever credibly threaten tariffs like we did just last week to help secure our borders stronger. So if we were trying to negotiate deals, and let's say we took up his proposal and we said we're never going to impose tariffs, well, then the next time we credibly threaten tariffs, one country eventually is just going to say, okay, we're going to see what happens, we're going to take their deal, and then we're going to sit there all embarrassed not being able to actually impose the tariffs because we took a principled approach against tariffs that Daniel wanted us to. I think, as a country, we should keep our options open. I am not at all proposing that we use tariffs recklessly or that we, just go gun-ho with them, but we should be willing to use them when it makes sense to, like it does when companies are dumping steel into our markets, or like it does when companies or when countries are not doing enough to resist the flow of illegal substances from entering our country. So with that in mind, we should have an open mind towards tariffs and be willing to use them responsibly. Thank you.
My opponent has said something very true today. Everything in economics has trade-offs. You're absolutely right, Ryan. And I hope that I've shown all of you here today that the trade-offs that happen when tariffs are actually implemented are a disaster for an economy and are inherently regressive. Now, what do I mean when I say something is regressive? Well, in tax policy, When something is progressive, it means it has a larger impact, relatively speaking, on those who have more wealth than those who have less. Something is regressive then when it takes more from those who, relatively speaking, have less wealth than more wealth. Tariffs will always be inherently regressive because they take the same percentage from people regardless of where they are. And they're not starting at the same point. Some people will have more, some people have less. And I've given you a lot of numbers and statistics to explain why, to me, it is an easy question. But what can get lost in all these numbers and statistics is the reality on the ground. Free trade advocates like myself get no joy in proposing measures that will likely negatively impact some people's jobs. But let me make one thing very clear. I am against tariffs because, thanks to economists, we can now see through the broken window, and we can see the actual cost of some of these actions. Because it is not in our interest to lose 5 jobs at the expense of 1. It is not in our interest to make it more difficult for Americans to afford a home. It is not in our interest to make it more difficult for Americans to afford basic necessities. It is not in our interest to stifle our nation's growth. It is not in our interest to threaten our neighbors, our allies, and our friends. And it is never in our interest to make a policy that harms the poorest among us to save a privileged select few. And if your trade-off is costing all of these things, then I'm sorry. You're gonna have to do a lot better. And you've better tried everything else first. For far too long, the politicians have hidden behind their closed doors as the lobbyists, the Jeff Ferries of the world, filled their heads with lies as they promise to save their jobs. And in exchange, these people elect these crooked politicians who would sell everyone out for a job, counting on our ignorance, counting that we will not be able to see through the lies of the broken window, selling us out. My fellow Americans, it has gone on for long enough. It has gone on for long enough. Join me. Denounce this archaic practice. Let's leave tariffs in the history books where they belong for good. Thank you.
I never thought I'd say this. Tariffs are not very sexy, but they're hot. It's a hot topic. So thank you, guys. I hope that gave some clarity. All right. All right, if you guys could please pull up your phones again and do the final vote. All right, the votes are in for this debate question, which we asked, would it be in the benefit of the United States to implement tariffs on certain goods? Our winner is Daniel Freilich. All right. All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. That concludes our night. If you want to support other efforts of the Dawson Society such as this, please sign up for our email list. A lot of our leadership members will be out in the foyer, and we can take your email and add you to the list. We have monthly reading meetings. We started impromptu debates, which is a much more casual version of this. And we do other cultural excursions. Thank you guys so much for coming.